Okay, so for people who haven't met me before, my name's Satyajyoti, and I'm part of the Sangha Night team. And if it's your first time on a Tuesday night, I'd like to welcome you, and I'll just briefly say what how the evening will work. So first of all, I'm going to talk for, I hope not too long, for about 35-40 minutes, something like that. Then we'll go into groups. And if this is your first time on a Tuesday, if you've just recently come off the newcomers and intermediate course, you'll go in a group together. Then we'll have a tea break, of course. You always have to have a tea break at a Buddhist thing. And then we'll come up here and we'll meditate. So it's quite a similar program to the one you're used to from Wednesday nights. Okay, so you've joined us, if you're new tonight, you've joined us in the middle of a series we're doing, which we've been doing all year since last October. And that's been a series about the stories, myths, images that come from the Buddhist tradition. And we're about to start a new mini-series tonight. And our mini-series will last through till October. And it's based around the idea of imagining the Buddha, using mudras. This is mudra, the word. And these are mudras. So mudras are hand positions, okay, that you'll see in different Buddhas. So you'll see that around the centre you'll see quite a few different Buddhas who have different ways of touching the earth, holding their hands, etc. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So that's the theme for the next 12 weeks or so. I don't know, maybe not 12 weeks, 8 weeks or so. And what I'm doing tonight is very much an introduction into looking at the life of the Buddha, or his experience of enlightenment through images, through mudras. So here we are at a Buddhist centre, Sheffield Buddhist Centre we call ourselves, and we're learning about Buddhist thought, Buddhist ideas, how to put it into practice in our lives. And it's interesting that at the moment, I think in Western culture, there's quite a lot of Buddhist ideas that are going quite mainstream. So it's quite common now for people to recognise the benefit of meditation. There's a lot of talk about mindfulness, more recently compassion. Quite a lot of Buddhist ideas are just kind of going into the mainstream culture, which is quite interesting. And they all come from this one person, this one character, called the Buddha, who lived 2,500 years ago. And the Buddha was a real person who really existed. The evidence looks like he really existed. There's archaeological evidence to show that he did exist. And so he was born an ordinary person. And it's interesting that because his ideas are so, I suppose, they've become part of culture to some extent, perhaps not much is known about his life. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about his life first of all. So he was an ordinary person who put himself in conditions, he underwent some kind of a transformation. And he woke up. So Buddha literally means awakened one. One who is awake, he who is awake. And many other people have had this experience of waking up, of becoming enlightened. But the unique thing about the Buddha is that he was able to communicate it to many others, and that he was able to form a community, the Sangha, which has, still going strong today. 2,500 years later, there's still a Sangha going that we're part of, that has come from the Buddha's vision, the Buddha's idea. And it's interesting, actually, that in terms of it being Buddhism, using the word Buddhism is quite a modern thing, quite a Western thing. At the time of the Buddha and afterwards, people who followed him were called followers of the Buddha Dharma, so followers of the teaching of the Buddha. They didn't have that word Buddhists to describe them. That's something that Western people, I think about 100 years ago during the Victorian time, described people who followed the Buddha as Buddhists. And sometimes people can be a bit nervous about the word or the title Buddhist. They find it kind of a bit too labelling or a bit too restricting. So if you feel like that, you can think, well, it's interesting, actually, it's quite a modern invention. What we are here is we're people who follow the teachings of the Buddha and what he brought into the world. Okay, so the Buddha. He was real, as I said, and he was born into a very rich family, a very much loved son. And he was brought up in a privileged enclave, protected from all the suffering outside of the palace. So he had lots of palaces, actually, not just one. Palaces for the rainy season, palaces for the hot season, palaces for the cold season. He had the best education possible. both intellectually and in terms of his physical development. And perhaps Vedanya is suggesting in one of his talks, like a similar modern young man might be someone who's like an heir to a great banking family, somebody who has homes in lots of different places, maybe like a flat in New York, a place in London, a place in Switzerland, who goes to the best schools, has the best education possible, has everything that money can buy for a person. And apparently the Buddha, as well as having all those benefits, he was also naturally a very handsome young man, and he took very easily to all that he learned. He very soon became the best amongst his peers in whatever he was doing. So I can imagine he was a very sort of well-rounded person. He could talk philosophy, he could play musical instruments, make up a poem when it was needed, knew a lot about warfare, I imagine. He could hunt, ride, shoot well with a bow and arrow, all the kind of skills that someone of his class and position would have had at that time. But he found that this endless luxury, pleasure, the diversion of his days didn't bring him contentment and happiness after all. Something didn't feel right to him. Something niggled away all the time. He'd actually been very protected by his family from some of the realities of life. And when he came across illness, old age and death, and the realisation that would inevitably happen to him, even though he was so kind of, special and protected, he too would get ill and would die. He was very shocked and very shaken. And it seemed to put all his pleasures and all his delights, sort of put them in another light, so that they became meaningless and empty to him. And one day he came across a wanderer, a homeless person who was begging, but there was something completely different about this person. I imagine that it was something very kind of grounded, very whole. This person was very content, just in themselves, just wandering about with their begging bowl. And this really inspired the Buddha. I can imagine the Buddha really yearning for that kind of contentment, that being at ease, that being at home in your skin. And at that time, actually, there was a bit of a kind of craze for leaving home and going off in search for the meaning of life. It was like the 60s. Lots of people dropping out, looking for different ways of being. So the Buddha did that too. He hit the road, set off on a journey. He cut off his hair, symbolically. He became a homeless wanderer, and he became dependent on begging. So he didn't get any food if people didn't feed him. He completely put himself to be dependent on other people. And he set off and found a number of different teachers. And he got as far as the teachers could take him and started to surpass them as well. So the teachers taught him all sorts of meditation kind of methods, and he did really well at those, and he had amazing kind of high levels of attainment, experienced lots of amazing mental states. But he still felt like that wasn't quite enough. That wasn't quite what it was about. So then at that time there was a practice of asceticism, which means basically sort of giving the body a really hard time. So a belief that if you suffered, your body suffered, you will through that arrive at some kind of special states of mind. And again, he was the best ascetic, so he stopped eating hardly anything, and just 1 grain of rice a day, and became incredibly thin. You may have seen pictures of the Buddha where you can see all his ribs, and he's really, really thin, like a skeleton. So that's him from that time. And he also did the practice of the 5 fires, which meant that you sat in India under the really hot sun, and then you lit fires in front of you, and either side of you, and behind you, and you sat there and kind of, suffered that. Anyway, so he did that, and he was so good at all that stuff that he got a number of followers. He had like a gang of 5 people who were following him. But he realised, this wasn't kind of anything that was going to lead to the end of suffering for everybody. He wasn't looking in the right place. He wasn't finding something that could help all people. So basically he tried hedonism. So that's just going for pleasure, wherever you can get it. That's what he was able to do in the palace. He tried amazing mental states. He tried asceticism, so punishing the body and suffering, and none of them seemed appropriate to him. So he accepted some food, and all his followers left him there. They said, "You're not a proper leader, you're eating now, so we're not going to follow you." And he remembered an incident from his childhood. So he remembered a time when, as a child, he'd sat under a rose apple tree in the shade, And his consciousness had just very naturally dropped into a state of concentration, a very relaxed, easy state, an unforced state that all humans can experience. And in that state, we can think very clearly. Our thoughts are very supple. We're free from craving other experience, or from anxiety, or from hatred. And so we can actually think rather than being thought by our thoughts. So it's a state of pleasure in which we can actually think clearly. And he realised, with this intuition, that actually we might be onto something. So he accepted some more food, some milk rice from a milkmaid who was passing, and he sat himself down under a beautiful large tree that gave lots of shade. And he made a vow that he was going to sit there until such time as he became enlightened. So he entered into the meditation, into this state that I described, this relaxed, this pleasurable state, and with a very supple, a penetrating mind, he examined his own experience. And as he sat through the night, something happened. So he saw his life very clearly. He saw the endless, infinite web of actions and consequences, and his mind became free, his mind became without limit, and it broke free of the veils of ignorance, of craving, of aversion, of self-reference that our unawakened minds see the world through. And until as the first star came into the sky, he realised that he'd broken through. He'd actually woken up, he was awake, he was a Buddha now, and he was free. He was enlightened. So after this experience, the Buddha needed time to absorb this really radical awakening. But after some time of doing that, he set off to teach what he'd learned to the followers he'd had when he was the best ascetic. So there's 5 followers, he went and found them, and he found that he was able to communicate to them what he'd been through. And gradually, one by one, they also saw it as he saw it. They understood it as he understood it, and they became enlightened too. So then they could teach others as well. And so a Sangha grew. So the Buddha was able to put into words the Dharma, the teaching, and he was able to communicate to others his teachings so that a Sangha started to grow. And the Buddha actually, after that, spent the remaining years of his life, and about 50 years until he was 80, as a wandering beggar. So it's quite interesting that he didn't choose, and presumably loads of kings would have liked him to come and stayed in their court and given him lots of kind of status and things like that. But he chose to be a wandering beggar. He went from place to place in that area of northern India, southern Nepal. And he taught when people wanted to hear him, he taught them. And he gradually built a community of practitioners, a Sangha around him. So, what was that Buddha like? What was this awakened being like? What would it be like if you met him? What would you say? So in a minute, we're going to hear a report from an elderly man called Pingia. Okay, there's been some controversy about how you spell it, but we're going to P-I-N-G-I-Y-A, okay? And it's definitely not to be confused with Pingu, which I have done, very embarrassingly, when once I met Sangha who was the founder of this Buddhist movement. It was very embarrassing indeed. Anyway, so don't do that. Stay with Pingia. Sangha knew what I meant. So the reading you're going to hear, Kate's going to read to us in a minute, is from the very early teachings of the Buddha, we think. So what happened was actually when the Buddha taught, and if he taught for 50 years, you can imagine he did a lot of teaching, but it wasn't written down at the time. It was written down several hundred years later, and so people remembered his teachings at the time, and they passed it down in an oral tradition until it was written down. And so that means that if you look at some of what's called the Pali Canon, which is the language that some of those teachings were written in, they can sometimes be a bit kind of repetitive, which I think is because people learnt them off by heart. So you learnt it off by heart in quite a repetitive way so you could remember it, and then you passed it on to somebody else. And in Buddhism, unlike some other religions, we don't have a kind of holy book, if you see what I mean. It's like, it seems likely that many of these were the teachings of the Buddha, but we don't definitely know that they were. And it's very likely, isn't it, that on the way, they got corrupted in some ways, things got changed, and also people probably added bits in, you know. So we'd kind of like look at these with a bit of a pinch of salt, you know. But as far as we know, this is from some of the very early teachings. So Kate is going to come up and read out, and it's just like a report. So Pingia was an elderly man, a very elderly man, and he met the Buddha, and he went back and he saw a friend of his, and this is what he said. And when he talks about Gautama in this reading, he means the Buddha. It's another word for the Buddha. Okay, thank you.
I will sing you the praises to the way to the beyond, said Pingia when he returned to where the Brahmin Bhavari lives, on the banks of the river Godavari. It was described to us by this man exactly as he saw it. But then, there isn't any reason why a man like him should lie. A mammoth of knowledge and completely pure. A man without desire. When a voice has none of the glibness of pride, and none of the ingrained stains of ignorance, then its words are full of sweetness and beauty. It is such words that I now praise. They called him Buddha, enlightened, awake, dissolving darkness, with total vision, and knowing the world to its ends. He has gone beyond all the states of being and of becoming. He has no inner poison drives. He is the total elimination of suffering. This man, Brahmin Bhavari, is the man I follow. It is like a bird that leaves the bushes of the scrubland and flies to the fruit trees of the forest. I too have left the bleary half-light of opinions. Like a swan, I have reached a great lake. Up till now, before I heard Gautama's teaching, people had always told me this. This is how it has always been, and this is how it will always be. Only the constant refrain of tradition, a breeding ground for speculation. This prince, this beam of light, Gautama, was the only one who dissolved the darkness. This man, Gautama, is a universe of wisdom and a world of understanding. A teacher whose Dhamma is the way things are. Instant, immediate, and visible all round. Eroding desire without harmful side effects. With nothing else quite like it anywhere in the world.
Okay, so this is how the Buddha came across to someone who met him. This is how someone who met him reported to his friend. And there are many other descriptions like this, perhaps not quite as poetic as that actually, but descriptions of someone meeting the Buddha, perhaps accidentally, being kind of a bit intrigued by the presence of the Buddha and asking the Buddha some questions. And then after that, that person awakening themselves, gaining some form of enlightenment themselves, becoming awake. And often when you read it, it's just a few simple words. It's nothing very kind of what seems to me very deep or amazing. And just those simple words had a very big effect on the person. And I think that's because they came from the Buddha himself. So as human beings, I'm sure you're aware that most of what we pick up about other people is unconscious. Now, I can't remember, there's a statistic which I'm going to make up now, okay? So something like we gain 90% of our knowledge or something from, from things that aren't just being said, actually. And we just gain so much more we get a sense of people, and we get a sense of environments as well, don't we? We get a sense of atmospheres. And actually, I think this is partly why my emails can be so distressing sometimes, or such a difficult way to communicate. Because in emails, you only get words, don't you? You don't get the writtenness of a person. So someone can write something in an email and it sounds really aggressive or something like that. But actually, if you were with them, you get quite a different sense of them. And in a way, actually, all we have is kind of emails from the Buddha. It's like all we have without all the richness that goes with, with general communication. And they've been memorized passed down, they've also been translated from their original language into another language. And sometimes they've been translated by people who are more scholars than poets, or more scholars than practitioners. So you get quite kind of clunky kind of translations sometimes. But so I think people, particularly after the Buddha died, or when they were separated from the Buddha, or for us now, is how do we communicate that presence of the Buddha? How do we communicate the power, the energy, the wisdom, the love that the Buddha must have had, that he was conveying to people? Well, what the Buddhist tradition does to convey that emotion, to convey that kind of feeling, is it uses archetypes, like some of the images we're going to look at, other images, stories and myths. So it's get a sense across of what the Buddha might have been like, by using very poetic ways, often magical ways actually. So it's interesting though actually that as kind of, now, 2,500 years ago after the Buddha, 205 years after the Buddha died, there are these thousands of different images of enlightenment. Just after he died, people didn't actually paint or make images of the Buddha himself. They just made images, particularly common ones were his footprints. You might have seen 2 footprints. Or they made an empty throne, so a place where the Buddha would have sat but not the Buddha himself on it. Or perhaps the wheel of the Dharma that he turned. There wasn't any kind of like iconic image trying to say what the Buddha looked like. But gradually, images of enlightened figures started to be carved and started in stone or in wood, started to be made in clay, started to be painted by artists. And it's really important to get that these aren't actually pictures of what the Buddha really looked like, because there was nobody there nobody painted a picture of the Buddha at the time, as far as I know. It hasn't survived. And so we don't know what the Buddha actually looked like. When you see images of the Buddha, like this one behind us here, they're an image, an archetype of enlightenment. They're not, no one's trying to kind of recreate what the Buddha looked like. And what they're trying to do is signify his teaching, and perhaps some other emotions you might get off them. For instance, a calm, a feeling of love, of contentment, a feeling of strength, of power perhaps. So gradually, images started to be made, and a whole extensive and sometimes bewildering array of figures appeared. And those figures actually appeared in the meditations of practitioners. So it wasn't that people kind of sat down and thought, I think what we need to do is express the compassion of the Buddha, and it would be good to do it like this. It was much more that someone would be meditating, and a figure would appear to them in their meditation. And then presumably that would happen to other people as well. So it's very much people kind of contacting some kind of archetypal image of what something like compassion might look like. So, compassion is one aspect of awakening, and each of these images, which we can actually have a look at now, let's have a look at these. So let's start with it. So this is called the mandala of the 5 Buddhas, and mandala just means basically a circle. And so these are 5 aspects of enlightenment. So what you'll see is that they've all got different colours. We've got a red one and a blue one, a gold one, a green one, a white one. And they're also holding different objects. Not in these pictures, but in other pictures, they have all sorts of other things associated with them. So a time of day, an animal, for instance, all sorts of different things that we can, that are to call up what kind of essence of enlightenment they're trying to portray. And a common image that's used is the idea that if you shine the white light of enlightenment through a prism, it will come out in different colours, like these different colours, like the colours of the rainbow. So each of these Buddhas is representing one aspect of enlightenment. And what a lot of Buddhists do is they will take one of these images and meditate on it. And through that they will actually particularly develop that aspect, but actually gradually they'll develop all aspects of enlightenment in their experience. So, if you want to just keep going, we've got, this is the blue Buddha called Akshobhya. Just keep going. Another golden Buddha, Amitabha, a red Buddha, green Buddha, Amoghasiddhi, and a white Buddha, Virochana. Those are the 5 Buddhas of the mandala. And there are many, many others. And don't worry if you didn't write their names down or catch their names, because we're going to be exploring those in the next few weeks, and other figures as well. But what we're particularly concentrating on today are their hand mudras, what they're doing with their hands. So we're going to look at quite a few of those over the next weeks. But today I'm just looking at 3 mudras. Let's look at those. So let's look at yes. So we're going to start off with a figure. This figure. This is called a Mohi Siddhi. And so Mega Siddhi, as you can see, is green. But the important thing for us today is how he has his hand. So he's had his hand up, and this is the gesture of fearlessness. So the great thing I like about mudras is that they emphasize that enlightenment awakening takes place in your body. Okay? It's meditation is in our bodies. Where else would it be? We have bodies, that's where we are. We are our bodies. So meditation, awakening will happen in our bodies. And perhaps like me, you might have a bit of a tendency not to be in your body quite a lot. So maybe to be in a screen, or to be in a book, or just not to be in your head. But very much we meditate with our bodies. So I think what's great about the mudras is they give a kind of kinesthetic experience. It's like we can actually experience in our bodies what they represent. So I'd like to just invite you just to have a go at this one. So just have a go at the fearlessness. Just see how it feels. Okay. So I'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to say that earlier I talked about the Buddha being enlightened under the tree and the process that occurred there. His mind became liberated, he became free, he became enlightened, he woke up. So what happened? Well, if you'd been there, okay, if you'd been watching it, or if somehow we could send a camera back through time and stream it to us live here, you wouldn't see very much at all. What you'd see is a man, a very emaciated man, a bit of a tramp really, a kind of raggedy man, very raggedy man, would sit down under a tree, sit there kind of determinedly, perhaps looking quite happy, I don't know, for some time, get up, walk about a bit, sit down again, and that's all you'd see happening, okay? Because what happened was an interior experience. So a lot of these myths, a lot of these images are a way to express that interior experience of enlightenment in myths, in stories. And that's what we're looking at, I'm going to bring together these mudras and these stories that describe the experience of enlightenment. And these are kind of very different stories, perhaps, than ones from the Pali canon, which I talked about earlier. These are very dramatic, you might even say over-the-top stories, okay? And the versions I'm going to use were actually, come from 2 sutras, Mahayana sutras, that were sort of adapted by the Danya. And you may have heard them before, we read them out quite regularly. But today, I'm really very grateful to 3 people who are going to come and read out different aspects of them. And please remember that they are dramatic, they're over the top, and it's I'm just really glad that people are going to read them out for us. So in a minute, Andy's going to come up, he's going to read an excerpt. And this excerpt is about fearlessness. So this is a story from the Buddha's enlightenment. It's, in the story, the Buddha is sitting under the Bodhi tree, and a character called Mara becomes aware that he's very likely to gain enlightenment pretty soon. And Mara embodies and represents all that calls us away from clarity, from understanding reality. He represents all those fears and desires we have, all the ways we complicate our lives actually by looking for happiness in the wrong places. So he's kind of like the archetypal really bad guy, okay? He's really a villain. And he's really unhappy that Buddha's about to gain enlightenment. So he calls up a great army to terrify the Buddha as he sits under the tree. Andy, please.
Mara summoned the terrible hair-raising army of his sons. His soldiers could transform their shapes and faces a million ways. Their heads and hands were twisted and distorted, their eyes flamed, shining red and flashing, their teeth sticking out of their mouths, their tongues lolling thick and rough like matting. With faces of boars, fishes, asses and camels, one-eyed and many-faced, 3-headed, some with speckled bellies sticking out, some like men crossed with goats, some with scrub knees swollen like pots. armed with tusks and claws, carrying headless bodies in their arms, with ghostly faces and monstrous mouths, or covered with red spots. Some were tall as palm trees, others were the size of children. Some were like birds with the faces of rams, others had the bodies of men and the faces of cats. Some leaped about wildly, others danced with one another, some sported in the sky, whilst others danced on the tops of trees. Some were like diseases that waste their strength, others like illnesses that infatuate the mind. With raucous, ugly voices, harsh and terrifying, some roared or groaned as they charged, scrounging. Some screamed, grab him, strike him, rip him to pieces, tie, cut, break, crush, away with Gautama and his foolish tree. Throwing spears and swords, javelins and axes, poisoned darts and uprooted trees, raining down rocks and burning embers, waving their limbs, they screamed and screeched with laughter, beating their chests and piercing themselves with weapons, their hair standing on end and blazing with fire, their eyes shining red and giving off sparks. They pushed and jostled as they crowded round to frighten the Buddha. Meanwhile, demons in the form of old women cried out, "Save yourself, my son, run away while you have the chance," while other creatures, lame, weak and hungry looking, ran around like chickens, waving their arms in fright, screaming terror through distorted mouths. As night fell, frightful forms were everywhere in the darkness. The wind blew in a black gale. Lightning flashed, thunder crashed, rain fell in torrents, filling the streams to overflowing and flooding all around as everywhere trees crashed to the ground. But not one leaf on the tree of wisdom so much as quivered. The mind of the conqueror, shining in his glory like a snow mountain at sunrise, remained unmoved. He saw these shocking forms as like a magic show, like a dream, like clouds forming and reforming in the sky. Thus he sees all things. With a mind as wide as the sky, he was untroubled by the armies of Mara. To try to frighten him away from the tree of enlightenment was like trying to frighten the sky. No demon army could harm the one with the diamond mind, not though their numbers were as vast as the grains of sand in the Ganges. He who had vowed to help the world would never rise from his seat beneath the great tree, not until he had reached the supreme enlightenment, the place of peace and immortality.
So that's a very vivid description, I think, of what our minds can do to us, how we can frighten ourselves, how much anxiety we can create. And in fact, you know, those images, those personified demons of anxiety, of fear, are worse than any I've experienced, luckily. So it kind of means, well, the Buddha could handle those. And he could handle those because he was sitting in steadiness. And also because he saw, actually, that those demons, they didn't really exist. He saw them as being like the sky. The demons didn't exist in the same way that our thoughts, our anxious thoughts, don't actually really exist. And so perhaps when we are being terrified by our anxieties, we can remember that Mara's army, we can remember that kind of personification of anxiety, of fears, and we can remember how the Buddha responded to that. And we can use the mudra of fearlessness, this mudra, to protect ourselves. So sometimes in meditation, if I'm getting really plagued by anxiety, I'll pick up my hand and I'll go like this kind of idea of warding off those demons that don't even exist. They're all figments of our own minds. Okay, so that's one mudra. The second mudra, here's some pictures of the mudra actually. And I just put this one in because this is a big Buddha in India at a place called Nagaloka. And he's doing the fearlessness. I hope he is. And I just wanted to put in, yeah, there's another version of it. So that's a close-up of that. Okay. And if you go back one, actually. So this is actually on land in a training college in India that belongs to our movement, the Triratna movement. So there are young people there who are learning Buddhism. And they've built with money this huge, great statue. You can see how huge it is. It's quite an amazing thing, actually. Okay. And so we're going to move on to the next mudra. Okay, so this is the mudra associated with Amitabha. And, okay, so there aren't when it comes to things like mudras and all these Buddhas and all their different characteristics, it's never neat, okay? So it's never just kind of, it's not very kind of corresponding. So for instance, you'll see Amitabha with a different number of mudras, okay? So he's got a particular one there which is kind of like this. Sometimes he has a bowl in his hands, sometimes he's carrying a flower. But I'm particularly interested in this mudra of meditation, which is like this. So if you keep going, yeah, and keep going again. Yeah, so I'm at this one here. So when we meditate, you may well hold your hands like that, with your thumbs joining. It's quite a kind of nice way, that's how I tend to, if I remember to hold my hands. So this is the mudra of meditation, the mudra of deep meditation actually, of contentment, of complete contentment, of not wanting anything else to make you okay. This is the mudra of being very settled, very content where you are. So you can try it out. I'm going to try it out. How it feels. And I was just reminded before the talk actually that it's quite a useful thing about this mudra is when you are meditating, if you become kind of over tense, you'll find that you're really pushing your thumbs together. And if you become too relaxed, you'll drop your thumbs. So it's quite a good way of kind of seeing how you're doing, balancing your effort in meditation. Okay, so this is the mudra of the deep contentment, happiness with what's going on. We're now going to have another reading from the same sutras, which Sarah has very bravely agreed to read. And this is about the opposite of contentment, particularly if you're a straight man, like the Buddha presumably was.
Then, fearing defeat, Mara sent in his daughters to excite desire in the Buddha. Their faces were beautiful, like flowers in full bloom. Their silky hair was scented with the softest perfumes. Their brows were beautiful. Their eyes were large and lovely as lotus petals. Their teeth were as white as shells. And they display all their 32 kinds of feminine wiles. Some in transparent garments. Some in transparent garments revealed half-covered breasts or the curves of their thighs. Some bared their thighs. Some stretched and yawned. Tussle their hair, gazing at the Buddha through half-closed eyes. Their lips were as red as the fruit of the bimba. Some swayed their hips to the music like palm trees, moving in the wind, jingling anklets and bracelets. Or they were dangling earrings, artful veils, moved flirtatiously, revealing themselves unexpectedly, or letting their garments fall to the ground. Some wore garlands of flowers on their breasts, and some paraded parrots and jays on their shoulders or on their heads. Some giggled as if discussing pleasures, glancing shyly at the Buddha from the corner of their eyes, or calling out to him as though filled with desire, saying, "Spring is here. The trees are in flower, the time is right for pleasure. Come, friend, let us enjoy ourselves. You are handsome. We are all well born, well made for pleasure. Here of our own accord, driven by desire. Only a fool would resist such pleasant, harmless invitation." But the Buddha stayed serene, smiling, his senses calm, free from passion, and in a soft voice as pleasant as the song of a nightingale, beautiful and heart-touching, he answered the demon's daughters. Sense desires are the root of suffering, bringing no satisfaction. Sense pleasures are like illusions. They come and go like bubbles in water. Like the pleasures we feel in dreams, they do not last and they do not satisfy. One who nourishes sense desire is like someone who drinks salty water. Their thirst increases endlessly. Only fools get stuck in such a swamp as that. Indulging themselves in this way, they are no use to others, and they are no use to themselves. But my firm wish is to be useful both to myself and to others. My pleasure is the Dharma, in meditation, in the deathless, in love for others, and in helping others. Mara found no foothold in the mind of the Buddha. His body, speech and mind are all perfectly pure. He is filled with love for all beings. No weapon or poison can harm him. No lust can catch him with its hook. He looks on the horde of Mara's sons and daughters, and in his mind is wholly tranquil. For he completely lacks any ethical faults they can use to trap him. He envelops Mara and all his following with a mind of love and compassion, sitting like a lion. He is filled with love for all beings. He envelops Mara and all his following with a mind of love and compassion.
So I think what's important here is that the Buddha isn't distracted by the sense pleasures being offered to him, because he's found deep contentment and deep pleasure in meditation, in the Dharma, in helping others. And actually from this deep contentment, from this not wanting anything from the world, we can actually, an unconditional love can arise for other beings. And it's interesting that he develops a mind of love for Mara, even for Mara and for all his followers as well. He develops love and compassion for them as well. So this is the mudra of meditation, of contentment, of just being at peace, at rest, from which unconditional love can arise. Okay, so the Buddha's still sitting under the tree. Okay, he's been attacked by the thoughts of fear and terror, the army, and he's been beguiled by the distractions of craving. And now what happens? So the next part of the story is the mudra of touching the earth. Okay, so this is the blue Buddha Akshobhya, touching the earth. And you'll notice actually that our Buddha here is touching the earth as well. And so you can try that out. And if you can't touch the earth where you're sitting, try and touch your chair, perhaps. Touch your chair seat. So it's a feeling of really rooting ourselves, of earthing ourselves. So, Pechavajja, you're going. So the next bit of the story, Pechavajja will tell us.
When he heard this, Mara was eaten up with anger and envy. He cried at the Buddha, "What right have you, you upstart, being as you are a subject in my empire of desire? What right have you to defy your king? What right have you to sit on the diamond throne of the noble Buddhas, petty princeling that you are, and a traitor to your rightful ruler?" But the Buddha enveloped Mara and all his following with love and compassion. With his right hand, he gently reached down to touch the earth, saying, "This earth is my witness that I have that right. This earth that is the home to all beings. This earth that is impartial and has no favourites. I call this earth to witness that I have the right to sit on this diamond throne. Earth, water, fire and air are my witnesses, and so are the sun, the moon and the stars. They can witness to my good conduct. They can witness to my many lives of practice. They can witness to my spiritual attainments." And as the Buddha reached down and touched the great earth, it trembled in all directions. Just as a bronze bell rings out when struck, so this great earth resounded, and then resounded again when touched by the hand of the Buddha. And then the earth goddess appeared from the ground, shaking the whole great world. Bowing to the Buddha, with hands held together in reverence, she said, "Just so, it is just as you say. I willingly appear as your witness. but now you yourself have become the supreme witness, the greatest of beings, the leader of gods and humans. Now it is you who should speak for all beings, and no longer I. Hearing this voice from the earth, Mara and his army were terrified and broken, and they began to flee. Like foxes in the woods who hear the lions roar, like crows at the fall of a clump of earth, they suddenly dispersed.
Okay, so here, this mudra of touching the earth actually calls up the earth goddess herself as witness. And she witnesses that the Buddha has practiced, that he's practiced ethics, he's practiced meditation, that he has understood, he's acted very ethically and in accord with reality. And so he's got every right to be sitting under that Buddha tree, under that Bodhi tree. He's got every right to be seeking enlightenment. And I think we too can use this mudra, this touching this earth, when we're threatened by doubt, when we feel that it's all a bit too much, that we can't do it, it's all a bit overwhelming. We can really just earth ourselves by touching the earth. Because we've got every right to be here as well. Just like the earth, the sun, the stars, we're part of the natural order of things. And perhaps by touching the earth we can relate to that. Okay, so the mudras here, I hope, are giving us a very embodied, a very human taste of aspects of the Buddha's enlightenment experience. And we've just explored 3 of them today. So we explored, we can test now, fearlessness. How does that go? Yes. Well, I don't know if with the right hand, actually. Anyway, we've had fearlessness, we've had meditation and contentment, leading to, from that arising great compassion, and we've had touching the earth. Okay. So over the next few weeks, the other talks will explore these and other aspects of the Buddha's enlightenment in much more depth, and we'll be able to see how we can build them into our own lives, how we can develop them in our own lives, open up to them in our own lives. So let me finish today just by rereading a little bit of Pingia's praises of the way to the beyond. So this is what Kate read before. Bringing the Buddha to our mind, calling him up in our imagination. They call him Buddha, enlightened, awake, dissolving darkness with total vision and knowing the world to its ends. He has gone beyond all states of being and of becoming. He has no inner poison drives. He is the total elimination of suffering. This is the man I follow. It is like a bird that leaves the bushes of the scrubland and flies to the fruit trees of the forest. I too have left the bleary half-light of opinions. Like a swan, I have reached a great lake. This prince, this beam of light, Gautama, was the only one who dissolved the darkness. This man, Gautama, is a universe of wisdom and a world of understanding, a teaching whose dharma is the way things are, instant, immediate, and visible all around, eroding desire without harmful side effects, with nothing quite like it anywhere in the world.